Dorian had always known the weight of his skin in a world that judged him before he could even speak. As a young black boy, he'd grown used to the sideways glances, the whispers that followed him in every room. But nothing could prepare him for the day when those looks turned into something much more dangerous. Accused by a white woman, his world shattered in an instant. Yet it wasn't just the police that showed up. It was his mother, the governor, with a secret that would unravel everything. What happens when the past you never knew resurfaces in the most unexpected way? Before diving into this gripping tale, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch more inspiring stories like this one. The late afternoon sun hung low, casting the manicured lawns and pastel-color houses in warm, golden hues. A gentle breeze carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass, rustling the leaves of the towering oak trees that lined the street. It was the kind of neighborhood where the world seemed perfect, where every picket fence stood straight and white, and every front porch held the promise of peace. But not everything was as serene as it seemed. Beneath the surface of this idyllic suburb, tension simmered quietly, like a storm waiting to break. Dorian Walker cruised down the sidewalk on his battered skateboard, his movements smooth and effortless. He was 12, skinny, with dark, curious eyes and a wide grin that came easily. His red hoodie was bright against a backdrop of the neighborhood's muted pastels, drawing attention like a single stroke of bold paint on a blank canvas. He wasn't thinking about the stares or the whispers that sometimes followed him in places like this. He was just a kid, enjoying the last golden hour of the day. A few kids played in their front yards, their laughter ringing out like music. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Dorian stopped for a moment at the edge of a driveway, his skateboard flipping up into his hand as he scanned the area. He wasn't lost, he rarely got lost, but he was looking for something. His mother had sent him to deliver a package to a family friend, someone who lived around here, though he couldn't quite remember the address. Across the street, Karen Whitaker stepped out of her pristine white colonial-style home. She was in her early 40s, her blonde hair cut into a sharp bob that framed her angular face. In one hand, she held a coffee mug. In the other, her phone. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she spotted Dorian, her eyes narrowing slightly. She didn't recognize him, and in a neighborhood like this, that was enough to set off alarms in her mind. Dorian shifted his weight, balancing the skateboard under his arm as he pulled out a slip of paper with the address scrawled in his mother's handwriting. His brow furrowed as he glanced at the numbers on the nearest mailbox, then up the street, trying to figure out if he was close. He didn't notice Karen watching him from her porch, her gaze sharp and unrelenting. She sipped her coffee, her eyes never leaving the boy. He was standing too close to the Johnsons' driveway, she thought, his presence out of place against the meticulously maintained perfection of her neighborhood. Her fingers tightened around her phone as a thought crept into her mind, unbidden but insistent. Dorian turned, scanning the houses for any sign of the right address. He spotted a woman a few doors down watering her plants and considered asking her for directions, but something in her posture, rigid, avoiding his gaze, made him pause. He sighed and adjusted his hoodie, feeling the weight of the stairs he couldn't yet see, but somehow felt. Karen stepped off her porch, her movements deliberate. She crossed the lawn to the edge of the street, holding her phone up like a shield. "Hey," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut through the ambient noise of sprinklers and children's laughter. Dorian looked up, startled. "You lost?" she asked, though the question sounded less like concern and more like an accusation. Dorian hesitated. "No, ma'am. I'm just looking for an address." Karen's eyes flicked to the skateboard under his arm, then back to his face. "This isn't the kind of place where you just wander around," she said, her tone clipped. "Who are you looking for?" He pulled the slip of paper from his pocket, holding it out. "My mom told me to drop this off for a friend of hers. I think it's over that way." He pointed up the street, his voice polite but unsure. Karen didn't look at the paper. Instead, she glanced up and down the street, her phone now firmly in her hand. "Maybe you should let me call someone for you," she said, her fingers already swiping at her screen. You know, just to make sure everything's okay. Dorian's stomach sank. He'd seen this before, felt this before, the way her words were coated in a sugary sweetness that didn't match the hard edge in her eyes. "I'm fine," he said quickly, stepping back. "I don't need help." But Karen didn't stop. She was dialing now, her voice growing louder, more insistent. "There's a suspicious person in the neighborhood," she said into the phone, her gaze locked on Dorian as though he might bolt at any moment. "Yes, I'll hold. He's wearing a red hoodie and carrying a skateboard. Looks like he doesn't belong here." Dorian's heart raced as the words hit him like a slap. He looked around, hoping someone might intervene, but the other neighbors were either too far away or too indifferent to notice what was happening. He wanted to explain, to insist that he wasn't doing anything wrong, but he knew it wouldn't matter. The narrative was already out of his control. Karen's voice was firm now, her tone dripping with authority as she spoke to the person on the other end of the line. "Yes, I'm at 341 Oakwood Drive. He's right in front of me. Please send someone quickly." Dorian felt his hand shaking, his grip tightening on the skateboard. The sun, once warm and comforting, now felt oppressive, its light exposing him in a way that made him feel small and vulnerable. The laughter of the children had faded, replaced by the distant wail of a siren, faint but growing louder. The sun dipped lower in the sky as the sirens grew louder, their wails slicing through the quiet suburb. Dorian Walker stood frozen, his skateboard tucked under one arm, his fingers gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. He glanced around, hoping for someone, anyone, to step in, to say something. But the street had fallen eerily silent, save for Karen Whitaker's commanding voice as she recited her address into the phone. Karen paced at the edge of her lawn, the phone pressed tightly to her ear. Her sharp blue eyes darted to Dorian with every word she spoke, as if keeping him under surveillance. She was tall and slim, with a polished appearance that matched her perfectly manicured lawn. Karen wasn't the type to ignore anything or anyone that seemed out of place in her neighborhood. Her personality was defined by a need for control, and she wore it like armor. She had worked hard to build the life she had, and she saw herself as the gatekeeper of this suburban sanctuary. In her mind, the boy standing before her was a disruption, an anomaly, and she couldn't rest until the perceived threat was neutralized. Dorian shifted uncomfortably, his heart pounding in his chest. He was used to this feeling, the way people looked at him when they didn't think he belonged. It wasn't new, but it didn't hurt any less. Dorian was small for his age, but he carried himself with a quiet confidence that often masked his insecurities. His mother always told him he had an old soul, wise beyond his years, but right now, he just felt like a scared kid. He glanced down at the slip of paper in his hand, his mother's neat handwriting almost mocking him. His mom, Amara Walker, was the person who kept him grounded, a force of nature in her own right. She was a woman who commanded respect wherever she went. Amara wasn't just a mother. She was a leader, a strategist, and a fighter. As the governor of the state, she had built her career on advocating for justice and equality, a mission she pursued with relentless determination. Her position came with power and influence, but also scrutiny and pressure. And though she loved her job, nothing mattered to her more than Dorian. Amara had always encouraged her son to stand tall, to speak up for himself, but she also knew the world could be unkind. She worried about him constantly, especially when he ventured into places where she knew he might face prejudice. That's why she had insisted on knowing where he was going and who he was meeting before he left the house today. If only she knew what was happening now. Karen's voice cut through Dorian's thoughts. "Yes, he's still here," she said into the phone, her tone impatient. "Just send someone quickly. I don't want this to escalate." Dorian swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to speak up, to explain himself, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Karen had already made up her mind about him. He wasn't a person to her. He was a problem to be solved. The realization stung, but it wasn't surprising. People like Karen always thought they were in the right, no matter how wrong they were. Across the street, Karen's teenage daughter, Emma, peeked out from behind the curtain of an upstairs window. Emma was a quiet girl, the kind of teenager who often went unnoticed in her mother's presence. She had grown up under Karen's watchful eye, constantly reminded of the standards she was expected to uphold. But Emma had a mind of her own, even if she didn't always show it. As she watched the scene unfolding below, something about it didn't sit right with her. The boy didn't look threatening, he looked scared. Emma's chest tightened with an uncomfortable feeling she couldn't quite name. Meanwhile, Dorian's mind raced. He had to think of something, anything, to de-escalate the situation. But before he could decide on his next move, the sirens grew louder, and a police cruiser rounded the corner, its lights flashing. Dorian's stomach dropped. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, about to be confronted by the police. The cruiser came to a stop, and two officers stepped out. The first was Officer Reynolds, a middle-aged man with a stocky build and a no-nonsense demeanor. His partner, Officer Martinez, was younger and quieter, her expression unreadable as she assessed the situation. Reynolds approached Karen first, his hand resting lightly on the holster of his gun, a gesture that was as unnecessary as it was intimidating. Karen wasted no time launching into an explanation, her voice loud and authoritative. "I called because this boy was acting suspiciously," she said, gesturing toward Dorian. "He's been wandering up and down the street, and I didn't recognize him. I just want to make sure everything's okay." Reynolds nodded, his gaze shifting to Dorian. "Son, what are you doing here?" he asked, his tone flat. Dorian hesitated, his mind scrambling to find the right words. "I'm just delivering something for my mom," he said finally, holding up the slip of paper. "She told me to drop it off for a friend." Reynolds frowned. "Who's your mom?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Before Dorian could answer, Karen interjected. "I don't see why that matters," she said. "He's clearly not from around here." Martinez stepped forward, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at Karen. "Let's give him a chance to explain," she said, her voice calm but firm. She turned to Dorian. "What's your mom's name?" Dorian took a deep breath, summoning the courage to speak. "Amara Walker," he said, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside him. "She's the governor." The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Karen's expression froze, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. Reynolds blinked, his hand dropping from his holster as he processed the boy's statement. Martinez raised an eyebrow, her posture relaxing slightly. Karen let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "The governor," she said, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Do you really expect us to believe that?" Dorian didn't respond. He didn't need to. At that moment, his phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see a call from his mom. Relief washed over him as he answered. "Mom," he said quickly, his voice trembling slightly. "I need you to come here." On the other end of the line, Amara's voice was calm but sharp, her maternal instincts kicking into high gear. "What's going on, Dorian?" she asked, her tone steady but laced with concern. He explained the situation as quickly as he could, his words tumbling out in a rush. Amara listened intently, her expression hardening with every detail. By the time he finished, her jaw was set, and her eyes burned with a quiet fury. "Stay where you are," she said firmly. "I'm on my way." Dorian nodded, his grip on the phone tightening. "Okay," he said softly. Amara hung up and immediately called her security detail, instructing them to prepare the car. She was already moving, grabbing her keys, and heading for the door. She didn't care about the evening plans she was supposed to attend or the calls she was supposed to return. Nothing mattered more than getting to her son. Back on Oakwood Drive, Karen crossed her arms, her lips pursed as she watched Dorian. She still didn't believe him, and her posture radiated defiance. "We'll see if this so-called governor shows up," she said under her breath, though loud enough for everyone to hear. Dorian didn't respond. He stood his ground, his heart pounding, but his resolve firm. He knew his mom would come. She always did. And when she did, he knew everything would change. The sound of the approaching car cut through the tense silence like a knife. Dorian stood on the corner of Oakwood Drive, eyes locked on the flashing lights of the police cruiser and the two officers still standing near Karen. His fingers gripped his phone tightly as his mother's voice echoed in his mind. She was coming. She always came when he needed her most. He could feel a sense of calm settle in his chest, but it was fleeting. Karen, however, was still watching him, her gaze sharp and critical, the edges of her lips curling into a smug smile. She knew something he didn't, and that, more than anything else, made him uneasy. His heart pounded as he glanced back at the street where the distant hum of a vehicle had become louder. The headlights now gleamed down the block, illuminating the otherwise quiet road with an almost surreal intensity. Dorian knew it was his mom's car, the signature black sedan with tinted windows. The familiar sound of the tires on the gravel made him feel like he was safe again, like he could exhale. But as the car pulled up to the curb, the unmistakable feeling of unease stirred again. The scene was about to change. Amara Walker stepped out of the car, her figure tall and commanding, instantly drawing the attention of everyone on the street. The evening sun caught the edge of her blazer, and she moved with the fluidity of someone who was always in control. Dorian's chest swelled with a sense of pride as he watched her approach. His mother, his protector. Her presence was commanding, even though she didn't need to raise her voice. Karen's smile faltered when Amara's eyes locked onto her. The tension in the air shifted. The streets themselves seemed to hold their breath as the two women stood face to face. The officers exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unaware of who they were dealing with. Karen's words faltered as she shifted uncomfortably on her feet. "I don't understand," she stammered. You're really the governor's mother." She looked Amara up and down, clearly still trying to process the weight of her presence. "Yes," Amara said coolly, her gaze never leaving Karen's. "I'm his mother." She reached out and placed a hand on Dorian's shoulder, offering him a reassuring smile that only he could feel the full weight of. "And I'm here to figure out what's going on." The officers seemed unsure of how to react, exchanging glances, their initial professional demeanor quickly cracking. Officer Reynolds, his bravado already having been diminished by the arrival of someone with far more power than him, stepped forward, his voice quiet and unsure. "Governor Walker, we were just—" "I don't need an explanation," Amara interrupted, her voice firm but not loud. She wasn't angry, but there was no mistaking her authority. "You were called here to deal with my son in this neighborhood. You know you're required to verify what you're responding to before you escalate a situation, correct?" Reynolds shifted uneasily. He clearly wasn't prepared to be questioned by a woman of such status, and it was clear his respect for the law was now outweighed by his fear of making the wrong move in front of a public figure. Karen, on the other hand, took a step back, trying to maintain her composure. "I didn't know it was your son," she said, her tone feigning innocence, but her eyes still narrowing with suspicion. "But he was acting strangely. I don't know where he's from, or why he's—" "You don't know anything about him," Amara cut in, her eyes piercing Karen's with a look that silenced her. "And let's be clear, Karen, you didn't call the police because you were concerned. You called them because you felt threatened by his mere presence in a neighborhood you believe you own. That's what happened here." Dorian looked from his mother to Karen and back again. The stifling silence that followed was broken only by the distant hum of the streetlights and the faint murmur of a neighbor watching from a window. Dorian had learned to hold his own in situations like this, but seeing the fierce way his mother stood up for him made him realize how much he had yet to learn. Karen's cheeks reddened, but she didn't retreat. "I just wanted to make sure everything was all right." "Don't lie," Amara said, her voice low but forceful. "You didn't want to make sure everything was all right. You wanted to make sure everything was the way you thought it should be." As the words hung in the air, the silence deepened. Dorian could feel the shift in the atmosphere. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding anymore. It was about something deeper, something more dangerous. He could see it in Karen's eyes. She wasn't just defensive. She was scared. Then, the heavy weight of the situation became clear. The simmering conflict, the racial divide, the way people saw him, none of it was about his actions. It was about how others saw him. And as much as he wanted to believe that his mother's presence would make everything better, there was something nagging at him, telling him that it wasn't going to be that easy. Just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, a new voice pierced the air, a voice Dorian had not heard in years. A voice he never thought would reach him again. "Is there a problem here?" Everyone turned toward the voice. The air seemed to freeze, and time itself seemed to hold its breath. Standing at the edge of the sidewalk was an older woman, her face weathered by time, but still carrying a regal air of dignity. Her white hair cascaded down her back in soft waves, and her eyes were sharp with an intelligence that matched Amara's. The woman's presence was magnetic, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause around her. It was Amara's mother, Dorian's grandmother. Dorian's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't seen her in years. The matriarch of the Walker family, who had been a powerful force in the state before Amara had taken over. Her reputation was one of fierce loyalty to her family, but also an unyielding, uncompromising stance on social justice. Her return to the town, at this moment, felt like the final piece in an unfolding story. Karen's expression darkened, and even the officers shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't just the governor anymore. It was the Walker legacy standing before them. The same legacy that had fought for fairness, for equality, and against the very mindset that Karen had just displayed. The weight of that history hung heavy in the air. Amara's voice was steady as she turned to her mother. "What are you doing here, Mom?" "I was following a hunch," her mother replied, her voice calm but layered with meaning. "I don't like the way this situation is unfolding." Dorian's mind raced. He could feel the change in the air, the presence of his grandmother signaling something bigger than a simple misunderstanding. This wasn't just about one neighbor, one call to the police. This was a ripple in the larger tide, a tide of systemic inequality and unspoken prejudices that had now come crashing into his life. "Is everything okay?" his grandmother asked, her eyes narrowing as she looked over at Karen and the officers. Before anyone could respond, a sudden movement broke the tension. A car door slammed, and a man stepped out, a tall, broad-shouldered figure who radiated authority. It was Dorian's uncle, Malik Walker. He was dressed sharply, his presence commanding, and it was clear by the way he surveyed the scene that he was aware of what was at stake. "I think it's time we all take a seat," Malik said, his voice calm, but with a knowing edge. And just like that, everything shifted. The calm that had settled over Dorian's chest was replaced by a gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach. This was just the beginning. This wasn't going to end here. Dorian's mother, his grandmother, and his uncle, these people were his family, his legacy. They were the force that had fought to break barriers and had faced challenges of their own. But Dorian had a sense that what was happening now was bigger than even their strength. The path ahead of him was unclear, but one thing was certain. This was no longer just about him. It was about his family, his legacy, and the war against an unjust system that still controlled everything around them. Dorian sat at the dining table, the late afternoon sun filtering through the window blinds in thin, golden streaks. The quiet hum of conversation in the room was a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded earlier. His mother, Amara, sat at the head of the table, her expression calm yet unreadable, while his grandmother, Eleanor Walker, sipped her tea, her eyes scanning Dorian as though searching for answers in his silence. The rest of the family had gathered as well. Malik, his sharp-witted uncle, and Celine, his older cousin who worked as a public defender. It felt like a council of powerful minds had been convened, and yet Dorian couldn't shake the feeling that the weight of today's events rested solely on his shoulders. "Dorian," his grandmother's voice broke through his thoughts, steady and measured. "You need to tell us exactly what happened today." He hesitated, the memory of Karen's smug expression and the officer's condescending tone still fresh in his mind. He wasn't sure how to explain the raw mix of fear and frustration he'd felt, standing there under their judgmental gazes. "It's not just about today," Dorian finally said, his voice quiet but resolute. "It's about how people like Karen see people like me. They didn't need a reason to assume the worst. They never do. Amara reached across the table, placing a hand over his. We know, sweetheart. That's why we're here. But we need to understand what this really is. What's happening beneath the surface. It's not just about Karen, Malik interjected, leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest. People like her feel emboldened because the system supports them. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of something bigger. Eleanor set her teacup down with a decisive clink, her gaze narrowing. Exactly. And that's why we need to approach this strategically. This isn't just about protecting Dorian. It's about making sure people like Karen understand that their actions have consequences. Celine, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. But we can't ignore the personal stakes here. Dorian, you're the one who was targeted. What do you want to do about this? Dorian looked around the table, feeling the weight of their expectations. He wanted to fight back, to prove that he wasn't just another victim of prejudice. But he also felt the creeping doubt of whether his voice could truly make a difference in a world so resistant to change. Before he could answer, a knock at the door broke the tension. Amara rose gracefully, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor as she made her way to the entrance. When she opened the door, a familiar figure stood on the porch, Detective Marcus Reed, an old friend of the Walker family, and one of the few people Dorian had always trusted. Marcus. Amara greeted him, stepping aside to let him in. I wasn't expecting you. I heard about what happened earlier, Marcus said, his expression serious as he glanced at Dorian. I thought I'd stop by and see how you're holding up. Dorian managed a faint smile. I'm okay, just trying to process everything. Marcus nodded, taking a seat at the table. I wish I could say I was surprised, but you know how it is. He leaned forward, his tone low and confidential. Listen, I did some digging after I heard about the incident. Karen isn't just some overzealous neighbor. She has connections, political ones. Amara's brow furrowed. What kind of connections? Her husband is on the city council, Marcus explained. And from what I've heard, he's been quietly pushing some pretty controversial policies, ones that disproportionately affect communities of color. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications of Marcus's words. This wasn't just about Karen's personal biases. It was part of a larger network of systemic inequality, one that reached far beyond their quiet suburban neighborhood. Eleanor was the first to speak. So, she's not just acting on her own. She's a pawn in a much bigger game. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. And if you're planning to take this further, you need to be prepared for pushback. Her husband isn't going to take this lying down. Dorian felt a spark of anger flare in his chest. It wasn't enough that Karen had tried to humiliate him in front of the whole neighborhood. Now he had to deal with the reality that her actions were part of a larger effort to maintain control over people like him. I'm not backing down, he said firmly, his voice steady despite the turmoil swirling inside him. I don't care who her husband is. She needs to be held accountable. Amara placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. We'll stand with you, Dorian. But Marcus is right. We need to be smart about this. If we're going to challenge them, we need evidence. Something concrete that proves what they're doing. Marcus nodded. I can help with that. I've been keeping tabs on the council's activities for a while now. If there's anything incriminating, I'll find it. Good, Malik said, his tone sharp with determination. Because this isn't just about Karen or her husband. It's about dismantling the system that allows people like them to thrive. Celine turned to Dorian, her expression gentle but serious. Dorian, this is going to be a fight. Are you ready for that? He hesitated for only a moment before nodding. I am. As the family began to strategize, Dorian felt a sense of purpose take root within him. For the first time, he wasn't just reacting to what had happened. He was taking control, determined to turn the tables on those who had tried to undermine him. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The real battle was still ahead, and the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. The night had settled into a heavy stillness, the kind that left everything feeling too quiet. Dorian stood by the window of his childhood bedroom, his gaze lost in the dark outline of a neighborhood. It seemed so peaceful from a distance, but he knew better now. Everything had changed. His phone buzzed on the dresser. A text message from Marcus flashed across the screen. "We need to meet. It's time." Dorian's pulse quickened. He had hoped the situation would simmer down, but deep down, he knew it was only going to escalate. He grabbed his jacket, the cool fabric feeling like armor against the uncertainty of what was to come. He walked down the hall and found his mother, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine in her hand, a pensive look on her face. "You're leaving?" Amara asked without looking up, her voice steady but edged with concern. "Yeah, Marcus wants to meet," Dorian said, pulling on his shoes. "This isn't over, Mom." "I know," she replied, setting the glass down with a soft clink. She stood and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Be careful. Don't do anything reckless. We've come too far to let anger control us." Dorian nodded, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for his place in a system that had never seen him as equal. And that fight had just become a whole lot more complicated. The small cafe where Marcus had asked to meet was nestled on a quiet corner of the city, its warm glow spilling onto the street. Inside, the smell of roasted coffee beans mingled with the soft hum of conversation. But Dorian could feel the tension in the air as soon as he stepped through the door. Marcus was already there, sitting at a corner booth, a file folder in front of him. His face was shadowed, the usual calm demeanor replaced with something more urgent. "Dorian," Marcus greeted, standing as he approached. "Thanks for coming." Dorian took a seat, his eyes scanning the file. "What's going on?" Marcus leaned in, lowering his voice. "You were right about Karen, but it's worse than we thought." Dorian felt a chill run through him. "How much worse?" "Her husband," Marcus continued. "He's not just on the city council. He's tied into some real estate deals that have been systematically pushing out black families from certain neighborhoods. And Karen, she's been helping him cover it up." Dorian's fists clenched, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just about an isolated incident anymore. This was about power, control, and a system that thrived on the exploitation of people like him. "Why would they target me, though?" Dorian asked, his voice low and laced with confusion. "What do I have to do with their plans?" Marcus slid a piece of paper across the table. "Because they've been keeping an eye on you. They know who you are. They see you as a threat." Dorian's brow furrowed. "A threat? I'm just a kid trying to live his life." Marcus shook his head. "No, you're more than that. You're the son of Governor Amara Walker. That means you're a symbol of what they can't control. They can't let someone like you expose what they've been doing." Dorian leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. He had always known his family carried influence, but to know that it had made him a target was something else entirely. "Are you saying they've been planning this all along?" Dorian asked, disbelief and anger fighting for dominance. Marcus met his gaze, his expression somber. "It's not just about you. It's about the power dynamics in this city. Your family represents a shift in the status quo. They're trying to silence you before you can speak out." Dorian's mind raced as he absorbed this information. Every interaction with Karen, every subtle slight, now felt like part of a larger puzzle he hadn't even realized he was in the middle of solving. And now, it wasn't just about confronting her. It was about something much bigger, about dismantling the very system that had been rigging the game for years. Marcus's voice broke through his thoughts. "There's more. I've been gathering evidence. I'm going to expose them, but I need your help." Dorian's eyes narrowed. "Expose them? How?" "I've got the names, the dates, the connections. Everything we need to bring them down. But it won't be easy. They have powerful allies, and they'll do everything in their power to stop us. If we're going to make this work, we need to be smart. We need to be strategic." Dorian's mind was swirling. He had no idea what it would take to bring down someone as powerful as Karen's husband, but one thing was clear. It wouldn't be a simple battle. It would be a war. "I'm in," Dorian said, his voice firm with resolve. "Let's take them down." The next few days felt like a blur. Dorian spent hours with Marcus, poring over files, digging through records, and strategizing their next move. As the weight of the fight ahead settled in, he couldn't help but feel the growing divide between himself and the world he had once known. His mother had been right. This wasn't just about one racist woman or one corrupt politician. It was about the larger system that allowed them to thrive. A system that needed to be dismantled. But the deeper he dug, the more dangerous the waters became. One night, after a long day of research, Dorian sat on his bed, staring at the scattered papers before him. His phone buzzed again. It was a text from his cousin Celine. "We need to talk. There's something you don't know." His stomach dropped. He knew what that meant. Celine was always the cautious one, the one who tried to keep him grounded. And now, she was asking him to meet. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew it couldn't be good. The old park they met at was eerily quiet, the moon casting long shadows across the deserted swings. Celine stood by the entrance, her arms crossed, her expression hard. "What's going on, Celine?" Dorian asked, his voice low. "I need you to listen," she began, her voice tight. "I know you're in this fight, but you don't know everything. I haven't told you the full story, Dorian." Dorian's heart pounded. "What do you mean? Why aren't you telling me?" Celine took a deep breath, her eyes darting around as though she were afraid someone might overhear. "Your mother, she's not as clean as you think." Dorian felt his blood run cold. "What do you mean?" "She's been involved in some of the same deals you're fighting against. She's not the saint everyone thinks she is, Dorian. There are things she's done, decisions she's made, that have put her in bed with the same people you're trying to take down." Dorian's world spun as the gravity of her words hit him. His mother, the woman who had always been his pillar of strength, the one who had supported him through every storm, could be true. "Are you sure about this?" Dorian whispered, the disbelief in his voice evident. "I wouldn't say if I wasn't," Celine replied, her voice trembling with the weight of her confession. "But you need to understand, this fight isn't just about them. It's about you too. And your mother's role in all of this, it's going to change everything." The revelation hit Dorian harder than anything before. He had thought he was on the right path, but now the line between ally and enemy was blurred beyond recognition. His mother, the woman who had always been his protector, was now tangled in the same corrupt web he had set out to destroy. His heart was torn between loyalty to the family he had always known and the growing understanding that the world he was fighting to change was more complex than he had ever imagined. As Dorian sat in the darkness, the weight of the world bearing down on him, he realized one painful truth. The real battle wasn't just against Karen, or her husband, or even the corrupt system that supported them. The real battle was within himself. Dorian couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. The more he uncovered, the darker the world around him seemed to get. The conversations, the hidden agendas, the secrets swirling in the air. It was all becoming too much to bear. He had always been taught that the truth was powerful, that it could set you free. But what if the truth only led to more questions? More uncertainty, more danger. The city's skyline loomed outside his apartment window, its lights casting long shadows that felt like fingers reaching for him. He had just come from another tense meeting with Marcus. They were closer than ever to exposing the corruption that had been quietly suffocating the city's most vulnerable. But with each revelation, the stakes grew higher. Marcus had become more anxious as the days passed. The weight of the truth seemed to be crushing him under its intensity. The more they dug into the files, the more they realized just how deep the conspiracy went. And it wasn't just Karen's husband, the political elite, that had been aiding him. No, there were bigger names involved, people Dorian had never imagined, and some of them were connected to his own family. The text from Celine kept echoing in his mind. Your mother isn't who you think she is. He couldn't forget the fear in her eyes when she dropped the bombshell on him. His mother had always been his rock, but now she was entangled in a mess that could tear everything apart. His phone buzzed, and his heart skipped a beat. It was from Marcus. We need to talk. Urgent. Meet me in an hour. The message felt heavy. His instinct screamed that something was about to go terribly wrong. The underground parking garage was cold and deserted, the only sound echo of Dorian's footsteps as he walked toward the dimly lit corner where Marcus had instructed him to meet. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, the tension in the air thick, almost suffocating. When he rounded the corner, Marcus was standing by a black SUV, his face drawn and tired. He looked up as Dorian approached, his expression unreadable. "Marcus," Dorian asked, his voice wary. "What's going on? Why did you want to meet here?" "We don't have much time," Marcus said, glancing around nervously. "I've got something that's going to change everything, but you need to be ready for it." Dorian frowned, sensing the urgency in his voice. "What are you talking about? What's happened?" Marcus took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, folded envelope and handed it over. "Open it," Marcus urged. Dorian hesitated for a moment before unfolding the paper. His eyes skimmed the contents quickly, and then he froze. The words on the page didn't make sense at first. It was a report, an official-looking document with the seal of the governor's office. The title was chilling: Governor Amara Walker's Secret Dealings with Corrupt Developers. Dorian's blood ran cold as he scanned the details. This was no mere allegation. This was proof. Documents, dates, signatures, all of it linked directly to his mother. It outlined investments, secret meetings, and financial transactions that made no sense. How could this be happening? How could his mother, the woman who had always stood for justice, be involved in this? "Marcus, this isn't possible," Dorian muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "This has to be a mistake." Marcus shook his head, his eyes dark with resignation. "I wish it was, Dorian, but it's not. I've seen the proof myself. The deals your mother has been making, they're not just with the developers. They're with the same people who've been pulling the strings on everything. They've been using her influence, and she's been playing the game just like the rest of them." Dorian could feel the ground beneath him shifting. His thoughts were a jumbled mess, his heart racing as he tried to process the impossible truth. How could she do this?" he asked, his voice cracking with disbelief. "I don't know," Marcus replied quietly. "But the fact is, she's in too deep now. If this goes public, it's over for her. And it's over for you too." Dorian stared at the document in his hands, his fingers trembling as they gripped the paper. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a destruction of everything he thought he knew about his family. His mother's name, her reputation, everything she had fought for. He was seeing it all collapse before his eyes. "We need to get this information out," Marcus said urgently. "We can't let this go on any longer. If we expose it now, we can take them down. Your mother's involvement won't matter. People will see the truth." Dorian's mind raced. He couldn't do it. Not yet. Not when everything he had ever known was crumbling before him. "I need time," Dorian said, his voice barely a whisper. "I need to think." The following days were a blur. Dorian withdrew into himself, unable to face the world outside. His phone buzzed constantly with messages, but he ignored them. He couldn't bring himself to read the texts, to hear Marcus's voice. He couldn't even bring himself to look at his mother. She had become a stranger to him, someone he no longer understood. One afternoon, he found himself standing outside her office building, staring up at the glass facade. It was sleek and modern, a symbol of the power and prestige that came with the position she held. It all felt so hollow now. Dorian wasn't sure what he was looking for. An explanation, maybe, or just a moment of clarity. He didn't know if he would find answers here, but it was the only place he could think to go. He walked inside, trying to keep his composure. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the elevators, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. As the doors opened and he stepped into the elevator, the weight of his decision hung over him. He had to confront her. He had to know the truth. Amara sat behind her desk when he walked into her office, the warm glow of the desk lamp casting a soft light on her face. She looked up when he entered, a flicker of surprise passing across her features. "Dorian," she asked, standing up, What are you doing here? I need to talk to you, Dorian said, his voice low but firm. It's important. She motioned for him to sit, but Dorian remained standing. He couldn't sit, not with the storm brewing inside him. Mom, I don't know how to say this, he began, his voice tight. But I know what you've been doing. I know about the deals with the developers, the money, the corruption. Amara's face drained of color, her eyes wide in shock. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, she shook her head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips, though it was laced with sadness. You don't understand, Dorian, she said softly. I never wanted this for you, but sometimes we have to make hard choices. Dorian's chest tightened. Hard choices. You've been lying to me. You've been a part of the same system that's been destroying people like us. No, Dorian, she whispered, her voice trembling. I've been trying to protect you. Protect us. You have no idea what this world is like. I had to make those deals to keep our family safe. I had to play the game if we were ever going to have any power. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Everything he had ever believed in, everything he had stood for, was now called into question. I never wanted you to be caught in this mess, she continued, her eyes brimming with tears. But you need to understand, the truth isn't always as simple as it seems. If we want change, we have to play by their rules or we'll lose everything. Dorian's mind was spinning. Was this the truth? Was this the world his mother had been trying to protect him from? Or was this just another lie to keep him in the dark? His heart ached as he looked at her, the woman he had trusted more than anyone in the world, and realized that he didn't know who she was anymore. Not really. In that moment, Dorian made a decision. He had to move forward, no matter what the cost. He couldn't allow the darkness of his mother's choices to define him. He couldn't allow her to control his path. He turned and walked out of her office without another word, his resolve hardening. The war he had started was bigger than he could have ever imagined. And now, it was no longer just about taking down Karen and her corrupt allies. It was about dismantling the entire system, starting with the lies that had kept him in the dark for so long. The second turning point had arrived, and Dorian was ready to face whatever came next. Dorian stood at the edge of the rooftop, the cool night air biting into his skin as the city below seemed to pulse with an almost sinister energy. The glow of the streetlights blurred into the vastness, like a sea of flickering stars on a darkened canvas. His heart beat in rhythm with the relentless ticking of time. Every decision had led to this moment, every lie, every truth revealed, every confrontation. There was no turning back. In the distance, the governor's mansion stood tall, a symbol of power and influence. But now, it felt like a monument to deception, a tower built on corruption that had festered for years. Dorian's hands trembled slightly as he clenched them into fists, his mind racing with all the revelations he'd uncovered. His mother's involvement, the betrayal, the lies that had kept him shackled to a truth he was only beginning to understand, it all led here. He wasn't alone. Behind him, Marcus stepped forward, his face hardened by the same weight of responsibility that Dorian felt. Their alliance, once tentative, had become solidified in the wake of everything they'd learned. Marcus had stood by his side, even when the stakes had escalated into something darker and more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. You sure about this? Marcus asked quietly, his voice tense. Once we go through with this, there's no turning back. Dorian didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the mansion, a storm of emotions churning inside him. There was anger, yes, anger at the lies, at the betrayal. But there was also a deep sadness. His mother, the woman he had looked up to for his entire life, had made choices that had shattered the foundation of everything he believed in. I don't have a choice, Dorian finally said, his voice cold, but the pain beneath it was undeniable. She's already gone too far, and if we don't do something now, it's only going to get worse. They had the evidence now, the documents that would bring the entire corrupt system crumbling to the ground. All that remained was to expose the truth. But there was a risk, a dangerous one. The people they were up against weren't just powerful, they were ruthless. This wasn't just about taking down a political figure anymore. It was about dismantling a system that had controlled every aspect of the city's life, its very soul. You ready? Marcus asked again, his gaze piercing. Dorian nodded. There was no more doubt, no more hesitation. He had made his peace with the fact that the world he had once known, his family, his home, his ideals, was a lie. The only thing left was to bring that lie to light. Together, they walked to the car, the weight of impending confrontation pressing down on them like a physical force. Every step felt heavier than the last, the air thick with the electricity of what was about to unfold. As they drove through the quiet streets, Dorian couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping over him. Was this the right thing to do? Was he truly ready to face the consequences of exposing the truth? But there was no turning back. He couldn't live with himself if he didn't do everything in his power to make things right. Inside the mansion, Amara sat behind her desk, the glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows across her face. Her expression was unreadable, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her calm facade. She had known this day was coming. She had felt it in her bones for weeks now, ever since Dorian had confronted her, ever since the walls had started closing in. The door creaked open, and she didn't look up immediately. She knew who it was. Dorian. She could hear the weight of his steps as he approached. I knew you'd come, she said softly, finally lifting her gaze to meet his. Her voice held a mixture of sadness and resignation. But I didn't think it would be like this. Dorian stood there, his posture rigid, his expression cold. There was no warmth left in him for the woman who had given him life. Only a searing anger that burned away the remnants of his affection. You don't get to act like this is nothing, he said, his voice barely a whisper, but there was a steel to it now. You don't get to pretend that everything you've done hasn't destroyed everything I believed in. Amara's eyes flickered with pain, but she didn't look away. I did what I had to do, Dorian. You have no idea what this world is like. It's not about right or wrong. It's about survival. Survival. Dorian echoed bitterly. You've betrayed everyone you've ever cared about for survival? For power. It's not that simple, she replied, her voice breaking. You don't understand what I've sacrificed, what I've had to do to protect you, to protect us. Everything I've done for you, for me. Dorian laughed, the sound bitter. You think I'm going to buy that? You think I can still trust you after everything? Amara stood up, her hands shaking slightly as she walked toward him. Dorian, please. You have to understand, this was never supposed to happen. I didn't want this for you, but it's too late now. You're already in it. You're already a part of this world, whether you want to be or not. Dorian's eyes hardened, the pain and anger now simmering just below the surface. No, Mom, I'm not part of your world, and I'm not going to let you drag me into it any longer. He pulled out the envelope from his jacket pocket, the weight of it suddenly feeling heavier than ever. He tossed it onto her desk, the documents inside spilling out. This is the end of it. We're exposing everything. The people you've been working with, the money you've taken, the lives you've ruined. It all comes out tonight. Amara's face drained of color as she looked down at the papers. Her hands trembled as she reached for them, but she didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. She knew this was coming. She knew the moment Dorian had found the truth, this confrontation would happen. But she hadn't prepared herself for it to feel like this. So final, so irreversible. Dorian, she began, her voice small now. I didn't want this for you. I didn't want you to hate me. But this is the only way. If you go through with this, there's no going back. For either of us. For a moment, Dorian stood frozen, staring at her. The woman who had raised him, the woman who had always been his source of strength, was now a stranger to him. Everything she had done, everything she had built, had crumbled to dust in a matter of days. He couldn't go back. He couldn't unsee what he had learned. I don't hate you, Dorian said quietly, his voice shaking with emotion he couldn't quite control. But I can't be a part of this. I'm not going to let you destroy everything I've worked for, everything I believe in. And I'm certainly not going to let you destroy me. As Dorian turned to walk out, his mother's voice stopped him. Dorian, wait. Please. Think about what you're doing. Think about the consequences. He paused at the door but didn't turn around. I've thought about it, and I'm doing what's right. For me. And with that, he walked out, the sound of the door closing behind him like the final note of a symphony, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. The climax was unfolding. The final confrontation had arrived. Dorian's decision was made. The truth would come out, no matter the cost. The question now was whether he was ready to face the consequences of exposing a system so entrenched, so powerful, that it had the ability to destroy everything in its path. The battle was only just beginning, and Dorian had no idea just how deep the darkness ran. The final confrontation had taken its toll on everyone involved. Dorian stood outside the governor's mansion, the cool night air carrying the weight of what had just transpired. The documents were now in the hands of the press, and the revelations were starting to ripple through the city like an unstoppable tide. There was no turning back. The truth had been exposed. But at what cost? Dorian's mind swirled with questions that no longer had simple answers. The echoes of his mother's voice still reverberated in his ears. Think about the consequences. She had pleaded with him, but he had known. He had known that this was the only path forward. The cost of silence was too high. But now, standing here on the precipice of everything, he wasn't sure if he had made the right choice. Behind him, the flashing lights of the police cars grew louder, signaling the arrival of the authorities. They had been sent to secure the mansion, to arrest those who had been involved in the corruption that had been brought to light. It was the beginning of the end for the empire that his mother had built, a world of manipulation and deceit that he had once been a part of. Now, it was all unraveling. Marcus stood by his side, his face unreadable. "It's done," he said simply. But there was a weight in his voice, something Dorian couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was the realization that they had set something in motion that they could no longer control. Dorian nodded, but the knot in his chest refused to loosen. He didn't feel the victory he had expected. The sense of relief didn't come. Instead, there was only a deep, hollow ache that gnawed at him. He had fought for justice, for the truth to be revealed. But now that it was, what did it all mean? The authorities began their work inside the mansion, taking the arrested individuals away in handcuffs. Amara, his mother, was among them. She had resisted arrest at first, but in the end, she had surrendered. Her eyes had met Dorian's one last time before she was escorted out. There was no anger in her gaze, only a deep, painful resignation. The woman who had shaped him, who had taught him to fight for what was right, was now a prisoner of the system she had spent her life manipulating. Dorian couldn't bring himself to look away. His heart felt heavy as he watched the woman who had once been his everything disappear into the back of the police car. Was this truly the right thing to do? Was exposing her, exposing everything, worth the destruction it had caused? "Are you okay?" Marcus's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Dorian sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know. I thought I'd feel better, you know? I thought when the truth came out, I'd feel like I had won. But now I don't know." Marcus regarded him silently for a moment. "Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel good, Dorian. Sometimes it's just necessary." But even Marcus's words didn't bring Dorian any comfort. He wasn't sure what was necessary anymore. The world had shifted beneath his feet, and the pieces of the puzzle no longer fit together in the way they once had. Everything he had once believed in, the ideals, the values, had been called into question. What was he fighting for, really? Was this the end of corruption, or was it just the beginning of something even worse? The sound of footsteps interrupted his musings. Dorian turned to see Detective Harris approaching, her expression serious but not unkind. "I know this isn't easy for you," she said, "but you did the right thing. You exposed the truth. It wasn't easy, and it won't be without consequences. But you did the right thing." Dorian met her gaze, his eyes weary. "I don't know if I did. It's hard to feel good about something when you've lost so much in the process." Harris studied him for a moment before nodding. "I get that. But sometimes the price of doing the right thing is too high. And it doesn't always come with immediate satisfaction. But in the end, it'll matter. People will remember this. Dorian nodded, though the weight of her words didn't bring him any clarity. What he had lost couldn't be undone. His mother, the one person who had been his anchor through everything, was gone from his life. He had brought her down, and he wasn't sure if he could ever forgive himself for that. The following days blurred together in a haze of media coverage and public outcry. The revelations were splashed across every news outlet, every social media feed, and every conversation. The city was in turmoil, its foundation rocked to its core. People were angry, and rightly so. The corruption had gone deeper than anyone had realized, and now that the truth was out, they were demanding answers. Dorian watched it all unfold from the confines of his apartment, his mind still heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. He had done what he thought was right, but now he was left with nothing but the aftermath. The truth had come out, but what had been gained? What had been lost? His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at it, expecting another news alert or a message from Marcus, but it was an email, one from an unfamiliar address. His finger hovered over the screen, curiosity tugging at him. With a sigh, he opened it. It was a letter, and the contents were brief. Dorian, I don't know if you'll ever understand why I did what I did, but know this. You saved us. You saved me, even if you'll never believe that. There's no going back from here. I hope one day you'll see that, Mom. Dorian stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. The words were a punch to the gut, a reminder of everything he had tried to forget. His mother had written this, from her cell, or maybe from somewhere else. It didn't matter. What mattered was the finality of it, the irrevocable distance between them now. For the first time in days, Dorian allowed himself to cry. The tears came unbidden, but he didn't try to stop them. He let them flow, releasing the grief, the confusion, and the sorrow that had been building up inside him. His mother had been a part of this system, a part of the very corruption he had fought to expose. But she had been more than that, too. She had been his mother. And now she was gone, in more ways than one. In the weeks that followed, the city began to rebuild slowly. The system that had once been so powerful was in shambles, and the people who had been complicit in its corruption were held accountable. But the scars remained, etched deeply into the fabric of the city and into Dorian's own soul. He never forgot the letter. It stayed with him, a reminder that the truth wasn't always black and white. His mother had made choices, flawed, dangerous choices, but in the end, she had wanted to protect him. Whether that made her a hero or a villain, he didn't know. He didn't know if he would ever know. But he did know one thing. He couldn't undo what had been done. He could only move forward. The city was changing, and so was Dorian. He had learned that sometimes the truth didn't come with clarity. Sometimes it left more questions than answers. But in the end, he had done what he had to do. He had fought for justice, for the truth. And in a world so broken, perhaps that was all anyone could do. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The world was healing, but the scars would remain. And so would Dorian, standing on the edge of it all, watching as the city began to rebuild, one broken piece at a time. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.